Do you spend a lot of money buying mushrooms at the market? Today, I'm going to show you how to start your own mushroom cultivation using what you buy at the market. Normally, all this cultivation is done in laboratories. To start, we need some kind of grain so the mushroom can feed during the entire first phase, and to have the mycelium, which will grow later on. And as for the most common grains we can get, on one hand, we have corn. This is the one you can get directly at the market. We can also use wheat grains, and on the other hand, we could also use brown rice. To start, I recommend that you use corn kernels for this first cultivation because it's a much stronger, harder grain and it holds up much better. It's all the initial treatment we're going to do. Since these grains might have unwanted dirt or some other kind of various impurities, and sometimes they can even have microscopic spores from other types of fungi. It is generally recommended to give all of these grains a thorough initial rinse. And this is one of the most critical first steps to do the thorough initial cleaning process before starting to grow this mushroom. If the water ends up looking much darker in color, we should definitely give it a second or even a third wash to make sure the grains are as clean as possible. After washing, we're gonna leave them submerged in water for about 8 hours so the corn kernels get fully hydrated. And this will also help a lot because if we have any spores from another fungus, once they're hydrated, they'll start to germinate and then it'll be easier to eliminate them. So we're going to leave it like this for 8 hours so it hydrates well. It's very important that we prepare a good jar so the mushroom can grow inside. Since it's a living organism that will be breathing, we need to create some kind of barrier so that carbon dioxide can leave and oxygen can enter, allowing it to live inside the jar. But these barriers we need to create on top have to prevent any other types of microorganisms from getting in to avoid contamination. There are different ways to do this. One of the most affordable ways is to use cotton, for example. And here, what we're trying to do is to form a compact little ball that's tightly packed, so we can really press it down firmly. And then we would carefully insert it through the small hole we make in the lid. So we end up with a result that looks exactly like this. This cotton will facilitate a continuous gas exchange in and out of the jar. But since we've packed the cotton very tightly, it acts as a filter and will prevent any harmful pathogens from getting inside. For example, it could be a spore from a fungus that could end up contaminating the entire culture, which we're going to prepare inside so we don't lose it. Another common method that is also very widely used involves using these specialized micropore tapes. And when you stick it on, the most important thing to keep in mind is to press down firmly around the hole to make sure that no pathogens get into the jar we've prepared. Either of the two options works very well. Once about 8 hours have passed, if we see that the water level has dropped a bit too much, we'll add some more water so that all these corn kernels can hydrate properly. And now we're going to get them boiling in whatever pot you have at home. We add a little more water and we're going to put them on the stove. When we see that it's boiling, we're going to lower the heat and let it cook like that for about 20 minutes. If, for example, before the 20 minutes are up, we see that any of the corn kernels, if they start to open up, we're going to turn off the heat and let it rest. The limit is either 20 minutes or when we start to see that any of the corn kernels have begun to open. Now, what we're going to do is drain all the water because now we want the outside to be dry, but we want the inside of the corn to stay moist so that when we grow it, the fungus can spread well throughout the inside. Now we're going to start the process of preparing the glass jars. It's always much better to use a solution of 70% alcohol as we go along with every step of this mushroom cultivation, specifically to try to keep the entire growing environment much cleaner and more sterile. After thoroughly washing the jars with warm water and liquid detergent, we'll let them dry completely on a rack, And then we'll also add a little bit of this alcohol to the inside of them to ensure they are ready. If there's any excess alcohol left in the jars, just turn them upside down so all the extra alcohol can drain out. For each of these jars, we're going to divide them into 3 parts and fill 2 parts with the corn we prepared. It's better to leave this airspace at the top so the mushroom can grow better. Once we have everything packed, now we need to sterilize it. We can properly sterilize all of these jars in a pressure cooker, but if you don't happen to have one, you can also just use a regular pot, which is exactly what I do here at my own home. At the very bottom of the pot, we're going to put a kitchen towel or some kind of protective cloth, so the heat does not directly hit the base of the jars while they are boiling. The difference with a pressure cooker is that when we use a regular pot, we'll have to leave it in for a longer time, and we're going to add water, making sure it reaches about 4 centimeters high. This way, when the water starts to boil, the heat will be distributed evenly. This helps us achieve better sterilization. One of the common problems we might encounter when using this specific kind of pot is that the glass jars can easily start to move around inside. Fortunately, we can solve this issue by using a piece of cardboard, for example, or perhaps some other type of thick cloth that we can carefully place between the jars to keep them steady. Usually, I always put one on the center jar. That's the one that's going to be in contact with all the other jars, and then I put one between the ones left on the sides. Now we're going to put it on the stove. At first, it's best to leave it on high until we start to see steam coming out, and at that point, we'll lower the temperature. As for the sterilization time, if we're using pots like these, we're going to leave it for at least an hour and a half to 2 hours. If we happen to have pressure cookers, about an hour to an hour and a half should be enough to make sure everything is properly sterilized. It's important that after sterilizing, we let all the jars reach room temperature, because if the corn, for example, is still very hot, when we go to inoculate with the mushrooms we bought at the store, it's very likely that the mycelium won't grow well. For this stage, before we inoculate these mushrooms, first we're going to spray the entire work area with 70% alcohol, and we're also going to sterilize our hands. It is really quite important to remember that when we do this specific part of the process, where we're going to plant the mushroom, we should try to do it somewhere safe and controlled right inside the house. It could be the kitchen area with all the windows tightly shut so there's no air movement at all. On the other hand, to make sure we have an even more sterile environment, to begin, we can utilize a specialized burner. This particular one is alcohol-based, and we're going to make sure to keep it positioned very close to the exact area where we're working. This is because the heat radiating from the flame creates a completely sterile environment all around it, where we can then start carefully extracting the specific mushroom samples that we'll be planting in the jars. When we go out to buy these oyster mushrooms, we should really try to pick the ones in the tray that have a beautifully long and healthy looking stem. And we should also take a close look at the caps, trying our best to find the ones that appear to be the most uniform in shape, because doing this will ensure that we have a much better quality mushroom to plant in the end. In these cases, when they're all open, it's better not to use them, because those mushrooms are already much older. And here, I'm going to use my hands directly. As long as we keep everything well sterilized, we won't have any problems. The one and only thing we really should not attempt to touch is the very center of the mushroom. And I'm also going to use a small glass container filled with alcohol to carefully pass it directly through the flame and ensure that I get some additional sterilization. I'm going to use my hands. We can put on gloves if we want. Once we have the stem, what we can do is lightly spray it on the outside to give it some extra sterilization, because now we need to keep the inner portion of the structure, which essentially consists of the mycelium that is actually much cleaner. This is so we can plant it in one of the jars. Here I'm doing it close to the camera, so you can see that I put it under the corn kernels, but it's always better to do this next to the flame to make sure everything stays extra sterile. Even though we're not working in a laminar flow hood here, where we'd have completely sterile air for mushroom cultivation, We can do it this way as long as we keep an environment without drafts, an environment that we clean thoroughly beforehand with 70% alcohol, and it's always better to work next to the flame. Once we've inoculated all the jars, don't worry if the little piece of mushroom ends up on top of the corn kernels, because once it starts to activate, the mycelium will grow downward until we end up with a jar like this. But after we've inoculated these jars, we'll need to leave them somewhere with absolutely no light. For example, you could put them inside a cardboard box, and it's best to keep them at a temperature of about 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit to speed up the mycelium's growth. In this first phase, when we're reproducing the mushroom so we can later use it for cultivation, we're actually imitating what happens in nature. When the mushroom starts to grow inside the trunk of a fallen tree, that internal growth happens in a place that's completely dark. So over time, we'll see that on the top, near where we planted that little piece of mushroom, the threads start to appear, which generally for this type of mushroom, when we're cultivating oyster mushrooms, are mostly white. And we need to make sure that this growth appears all around that little piece of mushroom we place. If we start to see that in the jar, if we did the planting on top, things start to grow. Mushrooms on the sides, on the bottom, or we see the mycelium is a completely different color. If it's yellow, dark, or orange, we need to discard it because that's a sign that we have contamination. Contamination can mainly occur at 2 points during this cultivation process. First, it has to do with sterilizing the corn. For example, if we leave the jar of corn for an hour and a half or 2 hours and we still get contamination, we should leave it for a bit longer. What we can do before planting is sterilize it for different lengths of time, and then we leave it in a room inside the house. And if we see that nothing grows, then that's the exact amount of time we need to leave it before cultivating the mushrooms. The second point where contamination can occur is when we work to plant in the environment we've chosen at home. In these cases, the most important thing is to keep everything as clean as possible and make sure there are no drafts. And it's important that we have some kind of flame source, like a burner, to create a much more sterilized environment. And on the other hand, everything we use 70% alcohol, so we can keep the environment much cleaner. Over time, when the jar turns completely white, if we're not going to use it right away, we can store it in the fridge for about 3 months. And if not, later on in this video, I'll show you how we can use this mycelium to start our mushroom cultivation using leftover wheat straw, discarded wood scraps, or even grass.